Bueno, creo que podemos empezar ya. Buenos días a todos. Soy Cristina.
I think we can begin. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cristina Manzana, and I'm from Pensamiento Iberoamericano for Digital Services, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And it's also great that we can hold this discussion in Spanish, a language that is so very present in all international issues. Now, I'm with an esteemed panel today, and we're talking about a topic that is very relevant when we're talking about cooperation, when we're talking about South-South cooperation and the role of middle-income countries. And without further ado, I'll just go on to introduce everyone on the panel because it's very important for us to get into the discussion and their comments. So here I have Mario Pezzini. He's from the Development Center of OECD. Then Jolita Buchkevini, she's the Director for Coordination of Latin American Caribbean from the DG International Cooperation and Development. Thereafter, you have the Secretary General of Iberoamericana, Rebecca Greenspan. Then you have Maria Dolores Aguero, Foreign Minister from the Republic of Honduras. Mr. Luis Tejada from International Cooperation and Development from Spain, and then Silvia Tejada, the EDD young leader from Peru. So they're going to tell us about their very interesting journeys, and I think that you can have more information on them on the website as well, and then we'll go down to the topic. So I'd like to begin with a question, same question for everyone, to see the different perspectives from the OECD, the European Union, the Ibero-American perspective. And so my question is as follows. What are middle-income countries contributing to development cooperation? Now, before I continue, I'd just like to remind you that the last part of the session will be for questions and answers. And these questions can be sent in to us via the EDD app. So if you have not downloaded the app, please download it now, and then you can participate actively. So I'd like to begin with the General Secretary of Iberoamerica. So good morning to you. And what are middle-income countries doing in terms of the South-South development and development cooperation? Firstly, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christina, and a warm welcome to all of my friends on the panel. I'll begin by congratulating the European Union for the new agreement on development, because I think this is something that was signed yesterday. I think it's a step forward in terms of the discussion and also about how we need to change and adapt development cooperation instruments and how we need to talk about development in terms of international cooperation and how the European Union is going forward with this. So congratulations to the European Union. We're going to now go into the adoption phase, but we see that the Commission has made major efforts. So congratulations for that. It's a very welcome document from our end, as also from the middle-income countries. Now, I think the first question that we can discuss is the categories themselves when we're talking about cooperation. But firstly, in the region that I represent, which is Ibero-America, when we're talking about South-South cooperation, it's something that's very important. Now, in my organization, we draw up a report, the only report on South-South cooperation, to see methodology, how can it be improved, what the country is actually doing within this framework. And we have identified 1,400 cooperation projects between the Ibero-American countries, and that's quite a large number. The number of, or the amount of resources, when we're talking about funding, perhaps cannot be compared to at the international level. But when we're talking about development and methodology, I think this is a substantial leap forward. This is something that has got us closer to other continents, other organizations as well. And in this way, we can register, standardize, measure the South-South cooperation that is taking place. Because we all know that if something cannot be measured, it's very difficult to improve it, and it's even more difficult to make it visible. So we think that this is a very important element. Now, perhaps another point that's important to highlight here is when we're talking about new methods of cooperation, we're not talking about substituting the old methods. We're talking about complementarity in terms of what is already done in terms of North-South cooperation. So it's not about replacing it, but I still think that the North-South cooperation is based on principles that need to be saved in a way. Firstly, all countries have something to learn, but also something to contribute. So there's no country that is so rich and so advanced that they have nothing to contribute and they have nothing to learn. At the same time, there's no poor country who has nothing to learn either. So when we're talking about cooperation, all the Ibero-American countries contribute as well as receive in this cooperation activity. So there's a degree of horizontality in South-South cooperation that perhaps is something that we're aspiring to in North-South cooperation, but is more difficult. So we need to end this dichotomy between the donor and the receiver. In the programs that we develop, there's no donors and recipients. All the countries collaborate and they all contribute to the Ibero-American cooperation programs. So they choose a topic, the countries associate voluntarily. That's another important characteristic, that this is all voluntarily. And then all the countries pay a sort of a fee to participate. So basically, you approve the projects and then money is assigned. So it's voluntary and there is a degree of solidarity. And I think that these are the main components or the main elements of what we talk about when we talk about South-South cooperation. And I think we also talk about triangular cooperation. So we are doing a lot with Portugal and Spain, and there's a lot of triangular activity, so to speak, in terms of this sort of cooperation. I think Spain is a pioneer in terms of this sort of triangular cooperation in terms of quality as well. Now I'd like to reach over to the Chancellor. How does she really see the South-South cooperation, a country that is involved as a recipient and a donor? Thank you. Thank you very much. Warm welcome to the audience as well as my panelists, my fellow panelists. Now in Honduras, we are very enthusiastic about being part of this panel. This is something that's very important for us and for our region, that is Central America. If we have to live up to Agenda 2030, this is something we have to work towards from our government, from our country, and we are committed to achieving this, even in our region. We are laying the foundation for the implementation of the SDGs, and this is a major commitment from our end as well. We are getting on board different development actors, but at the same time, it's important to say that the challenges remain. Now, this is a reality that is shared by everyone in our region. We are assigning resources within the country as well, so that we can live up to our development goals. But these resources are not enough. And this is where we have to reiterate the role of international development cooperation. Therefore, we think that our entry into this category of middle-income countries is limited. Now, I'd like to just touch on some very important topics for Honduras. And maybe some topics are known, some are not. But Honduras is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate change. In recent years, we have faced climate disasters like the El Nino tornado that has led to droughts. It's led to major concerns in terms of food security. And recently, we've seen an emergence of pests as well. And this is a real situation on the ground. And irrespective of all the resources that we might be able to mobilize, North-South cooperation, this traditional model, continues to be very important. Now, I'd like to quickly touch on the topic, or rather the question that was posed to us. In this context, when we're talking about reaching the SDGs, we are carrying out an assessment with the United Nations where we're trying to identify where our efforts should be focused, while at the same time reiterating the fact that we are going to continue to make the best efforts possible, but our partners, our partner countries like the European Union and other countries remain very important partners in helping us achieve these goals. The reality of international development cooperation has changed. This is true. This also reflects the changes in our national realities. So we have to assume this paradigm shift. So I am sure that the North-South cooperation is going to produce results. We've already had a number of success stories that have come out. For example, in the topic of coffee in Honduras, this is a point of pride, and we have a lot of success stories to share here. Also, when we talk about judicial assistance, we have some very good experiences also in the healthcare sector, and I'm very proud to say that we are at the forefront or right at the point of launching a South-South cooperation catalog. And this is something that we've called Sharing Honduras. And I hope that all of you can look at this document, this report, and you can make the most of it, really. So, as a country, we are working towards this goal. We are trying to live up to this responsibility. We are taking on today's challenges, but at the same time, we all have a shared responsibility when we are looking at this globalized world.
Now, I'd like to ask you, what is the view of the European Union from the point of view of this South-South cooperation and the new approach? How do you see this from Brussels? Well, thank you very much for the question. As you can well imagine, Rebecca was answering this question because it's very easy. Today it's easy. Why? We have the consensus on development. This is the European Union's response. This is how we will be looking at the world over the next few years. So thank you very much for your support, Rebecca. For months, you've been providing this. It wasn't easy to reach a consensus because it required a change in paradigm. We all are aware of the focus on poverty, but the world has changed. And particularly if you look at Latin America, there are challenges. Obviously, tackling poverty is something that hasn't disappeared, but challenges are much bigger and much more complex. So there isn't any one answer for the same problem in different countries when you compare different countries. When you look at the success of Latin America, it's obvious that poverty still exists. There are countries that have to struggle in this. For this region has been growing significantly over the past few years. Trade has been playing a significant role as well. But the question still is, are development challenges disappearing with growth or not? Do they disappear or not when there's growth? Is it easier to deal with them or not? Is there less inequality when you have pure economic growth, when you have statistics on growth and GDP? Or is there no link between that and equality? If you look at Latin America, there are all of these challenges. You have the middle income class or status, which is strong, even stronger than before, much stronger than before. But the middle-income class is still very vulnerable. We do recognize that statistics are very positive, significant improvements, better than ever. But are there sufficiently robust public institutions in place? Is the tax system working? But it's not because of a lack of will of the countries. Is it because the institutions don't have a sufficiently robust standing to be able to proceed to efficient collection of public resources and then invest these resources? And then are they being invested in the right ways for those who need the greatest support? So this is something that we have to think about. We have to reflect on. Those of us who work on development issues, how do we position ourselves vis-a-vis our partners to be able to help, to be mutually supportive as well, and to make sure that the success taking place in the countries we're looking at will continue, that the successes don't disappear, that we don't step backwards. It is very important for us to demonstrate today that we are very strong, highly committed partners. That is to accompany Latin America and the Caribbean. We in the EU are firm partners. And why? It's because we share the same values. We organized an activity where we discussed precisely this, how to define our future. And in looking at the future in the European Commission, we invited everyone. This was a couple of weeks ago. And those from Latin America attended the discussion and said, well, is this the answer? We have the same shared view of the world, and it is easier for us to be partners, to fight together and to share. But with the SDGs at the heart of the development philosophy, we are all developing countries in one sense or another. And talking about high middle-income countries and so on, it's very easy to use these terms because we like to compartmentalize everything in the world and put countries in different boxes. And even looking at people, you know, if somebody asked me years ago, is this person good or not, good or bad? And it's difficult to answer because neither one nor the other. So compartmentalization is not very useful in most cases. So the challenges are based, first of all, on our positioning. And this is the first step. The first step is a search for answers. And we're ready to identify this set of financial measures that would be able to give support. We're not talking about huge amounts. I've always said if we're working in Latin America and the Caribbean, with very little money, we can do tremendous things. It's incredible. But it is an enormous investment of knowledge. As I said, our values are shared, climate change, openness to trade. We want to strive for better governance and safety and so on. All of these issues are at the heart of our relationship. And I think we have many measures in this triangular cooperation or South-South cooperation that could be based on sharing our technical assistance and experience. There are many areas in which we could provide a lot. But we also have to look at innovative approaches, not only in the private sector, which is a driving force engine, but we're not just looking at profit, but sustainable development results. But it's also important for us to create growth with a development focus and to introduce innovative approaches and measures that will help us to tackle development issues in the various countries. And that's where we have some problems. When some countries are included in this package, they don't have access to development financing, and it's a very difficult problem, shared problem. I would even call it a struggle today. But But hopefully with this discussion, we'll be able to make headway and find solutions. I'm sorry if I'm exaggerating a bit. Well, having heard from the EU, I'd like to ask what the OECD's viewpoint is. Because you're often called the club of rich countries, or rich countries club. So how do you see this in the development of this cooperation? Answer, well, I'm a little bit in a weak position to answer this. First of all, because you've been asked me to speak in Spanish, which isn't my strong language. Well, you could speak in English? No. Well, I mean, if you would accept Italian, then I could. But no, I have the honor of heading the development center with 52 countries. Many of the countries in the group are Latin American, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and so on, Costa Rica, among others. Yes. And, well, Honduras will come in very soon, I hope. And China, India, Indonesia, there are many. So this is where we do carry out South-South cooperation in a manner of speaking, as well as North-South cooperation. But I think our position has been often presented. But let me just sum up in 6 points. The world has changed. Over the past 30 years, the center of gravitation has moved from the Atlantic to the eastern part, to the east of Turkey, and it's still moving east towards China as well as south. So as a result, many countries have had a growth rate that are more than double the average. If you look at 2000 to 2010, with a double growth rate, there are 83 countries that have doubled their growth rate. So the world has changed in terms of traditional economic indicators. Secondly, all countries have agreed and approved the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Well, the other question is how they will be implemented. But, well, those of you who have experienced the UN will know that the discussions are taking place on this point. But behind the SDGs, what is the reading we should have of this? The idea of traditional modernization. Well, we've already developed certain guidelines. But the idea that developing countries should imitate what developed countries should do is no longer holds water. What we have to try, we can't just reduce everything to one single approach. That doesn't work. Now, that's the second point. Third point, traditional cooperation, giving development assistance, development aid, is also problematic. And let me emphasize the efforts undertaken by the Commission, particularly Jolita's work. The position to say that cooperation is not just aid to the least developed countries to fight extreme poverty, but it's a matter of tackling the challenges and bottlenecks which do not allow countries to go through or to escape from the middle-income trap. But this creates a completely different approach. Now, let us look at an example for all. There were the Marshall funds at the beginning for this, the current development model that has existed. Remember, after the Second World War, France, Italy, England, Germany, these were not the least developed countries. These were countries that had a particular challenge. So with the money, what was done? The organization was converted into a place in which we escaped from, well, we escape from the experiences of public policies, but I mean, they were very useful for the governments, but this didn't mean that development cooperation helps. It's just not a matter of aid, it's much more. And this is what we're talking about, the box of tools, not only ODA, official development aid, but the need to change the philosophy. So it's not just the SDGs and the Commission that are changing approaches. There's an experience of exchange and cooperation between the various countries that have been very active. I think Argentina was one of the first countries to promote South-South cooperation energetically. I think it was in 2018 or 2019, I'm not surprised that there's going to be an initiative from the United Nations to discuss the South-South Cooperation. But Japan was also very active in triangular cooperation. Spain, of course, has been very active. But also I have to name the elephant in the room. All of this change taking place globally is not due only, but to a great extent, I'm sure, to the appearance of the emergence of new development partners. China has become the leading partner of Africa since 2009. It is the main trading partner of Chile, Peru, Argentina, and to some extent Brazil. This is China. So what is happening in the world? 2 weeks ago, I was at the One Belt, One Road Congress promoted by the Chinese government, 29 heads of state and government, and 70-odd international organizations. What were we discussing? We were not in the steering committee, but something that was obvious is that China's role and investment is going to be much, much greater than the Marshall Funds. No, we're being told that there's tremendous South-South cooperation. And here I think the Giolita's description of the values and the missions, this is fundamental. But we're not just discussing a marginal issue or a different way of approaching aid for development. We're talking about the very heart of what has been happening over the past 30 years in terms of economic development and cooperation practices. China in Central Asia has come forward and is doing a lot in Africa. China is contributing the most in infrastructure. Last week, the biggest infrastructure project was launched, the train between Nairobi and Mombasa, the biggest infrastructure project in the last 100 years in Africa. And this is China doing it. So how can we reorganize ourselves in the face of this, in the context of this world in which Giolita is totally right? Practically everything is changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now let's talk about Spain and Spain's development cooperation. You've been touted as one of the major actors here in triangular cooperation. Yes, thank you. Now, we act in many different ways. Perhaps the most important one is the aid that we give to Sahib in their South-South cooperation. So it's not just about material cooperation in the South, but we also need to have initiatives that can, in fact, describe themselves, articulate themselves, and there's also a methodology to South-South cooperation. And we have to ensure that these aspects go beyond just particular projects. For example, when we're talking about global public goods and the construction of the same, then we're talking about development of cooperation with middle-income countries. This is some work that is constantly ongoing. So this sort of approach of collective effort is one of the most important aspects in our South-South cooperation. I think we also have to talk about SIGIB's role and how they are very important in bringing together all the different agencies in the South, because at the end of the day, there are major differences in income and level of development in these various countries. You have Costa Rica, El Salvador, etc., who have also very particular conditions. So one of the very important aspects of our work is to support agencies. Now, these agencies might ask for assistance when they are being set up. They might ask for counseling, and they might want to emulate our model in a way. Then you have the Colombian agency, for example, where we've developed a South-South cooperation strategy, where we've talked about, where we mirrored the strategy that we have for Eastern Europe and Asia as well, then with Peru. we've looked at emulating existing models as well. And so therefore we tap into our existing experience and we adapt them to the regional context. Because many Latin American countries have come up with answers themselves to their development challenges, to eradication of extreme poverty. They have found allies in Latin American countries themselves. So the main aspect in South-South cooperation is action within the region itself and working with the entire region. But another important aspect that needs to be looked at in the future is for them to be able to project their solutions to the rest of the world as well. We have a program financed by the European Union. It's the serial program where they're talking about creating farms, emulating a model that exists in Brazil. So this is a creation of solutions. It's a very interesting approach. And SEGIP and other agencies that are involved in development can take up these models and apply them elsewhere as well. Another topic we work on intensively are the projects themselves. When we're talking about triangular cooperation, we have quite a silent role, frankly. The people who are working on the ground are the agencies themselves. Now, these programs and these projects have a role of funding. We fund about 50% together with the agency that we're working with. We work with a number of different agencies, not just in Argentina or Brazil, for example, but we also look at other countries, El Salvador, etc. So, in this context, we have to get used to preparing projects with these agencies. Because on one hand, we have to carry out assessments, and then we also have to share experiences. And there is a cumulative effect. This leads to the region developing a certain identity, and we also outline certain procedures that can be followed. Now, what are the challenges for the future? I think this has already been touched on. One very important aspect here is this cumulative effect of experiences, that this success can be projected outwards as well, that it can reach out to other countries and regions in development, and we can maybe apply this in Africa or elsewhere. Slowly but surely we can get there. Furthermore, I think we also have to think of getting private sector on board. But because today we're talking about collaboration between agencies, but now we've moved forward where we also have bilateral projects with private sector companies. I think we have to think about projects where the private sector is on board. For example, with the Mexican agency, for example, we have a number of different projects where we're working with companies within Mexico. I think what we have to continue to highlight is the global vision. If Spain goes there alone, it has a role, but if we were to go there as the European Union, our presence would be even greater. Jolita is a cornerstone of our work, and she's definitely someone who I collaborate with closely when I'm drawing up my development cooperation program. So, if we project ourselves as part of the Ibero-American panorama, I think that we would be able to work much better. And our challenge then would be to see how we can get the Ibero-American region on board and how we can come up with solutions for the whole region itself. When we're talking about middle-income countries in Latin America or Asia, I think that things would become much more attractive if we were to share this model that we've developed in the Ibero-American region. So I think we need to share these solutions. Thank you very much. And then, of course, we have the issue of receptors, the people who benefit from aid. Now, she works directly with farmers, so let's see what Sylvia has to say. Good morning, everyone. So I work in an association that represents exporters in Peru. Now, firstly, I'd like to talk about what is a middle-income country, my country, Peru. What are the challenges that we have to overcome to comply with the SDGs? But firstly, a personal note. I am part of the transition generation. We are moving from a state of war to an era of peace and economic development. Terrorism has been a scourge in Peru, And now there have been changes. The constitution has changed and we've come up with a more longer term plan. And this has then led to the Peru we know today. So the first hurdle that I have identified is corruption. I mean, this is not something that only happens in Peru. This happens all over the world. But especially in Peru, we lose $10 billion every year due to corruption. So we need to have accounting. We need to have a enforcement of fiscal and tax measures, and this is something that is very important for many middle-income countries represented here. Secondly, the youth. We young people have been educated to be workers, but there is still no policy in place to educate entrepreneurs. So we need to change the mindset. This has to change on the side of institutions, educational institutions, there's also the public sector, so that we are educated in a way that we ourselves can create jobs. There are 50,000 young people in Peru at the moment who are unemployed. And now let me just talk about an experience from my association, the Association of Exporters. Now, we also train people, we train entrepreneurs in terms of export. Furthermore, there's a fair where we have students that participate. We invite all private sector companies so that we can create some connections. Some can be sponsors and others can also perhaps, some students can become part of their traineeship programs in companies. And in this way, we can have an active economic population in society. Another important point when we're talking about education, we have to talk about women's empowerment. In Peru, we have a ministry for women. So there is a lot that has been done to include women and to empower them in many different socio-economic sectors. However, we still don't have a very high degree of representation in middle management and higher management. So I participate in company committees where we deal with CEOs, managers, directors, and well, still a very, very low percentage of women are represented in this high-level management. I guess this panel is exemplary in a way because we have more women than men. Another point now I'd like to touch on is climate change. Active participation and involvement of citizens in climate change actions is key. I think all countries are on the same page here in terms of policies. We all commit to doing things, but it's when we involve society, the youth, in the actions that have to be done to change things, that is still not done. Furthermore, within climate change, we have two different aspects. We have prevention, which is very important so we don't continue to generate negative impact on the climate. And secondly, preparation. We have to be prepared for the consequences that will occur, come what may, due to the climate change that has already occurred. 5 important departments of Peru were affected this year. These are departments that are very important for agriculture, but even urban areas were affected. Now, everyone played their part, the private sector, the public sector, citizens themselves supported these 5 regions. But at the end of the day, a lot of reconstruction has to be done, and cities are not equipped to deal with extreme climatic phenomena. For example, rain in the coastal regions of Peru, in urban areas, they're not built up to really deal with very heavy rain, so things need to change here. Now, in spite of all of this, Peru has done a lot of good work as well. We've made a lot of progress. We have reduced extreme poverty by 50%, from 50% to 22%, so we're on the right track. Now, in integration and cooperation as well, I'm sure the majority of people here have talked about the Pacific Alliance. This is an alliance that has been drawn up between countries in the Pacific, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. This is helping us greatly. This is helping us to come together and to also engage in South-South cooperation with other continents as well. We've also set up sectoral committees with associations in respective countries, especially when we're talking about the agro-food industry. So this allows us to talk about technical issues that we need to change in order to improve trade and also overcome barriers and many other difficult issues. And now just to conclude, I just wanted to summarize in a way, because within the issue of international cooperation, every player has their own interest. The private sector has its role, the public sector has its role, international cooperation has another role to play, and then academia as well, because education, like I said, is key. So education has its role to play as well. But within all of this and all of these different players, we need to come together to form a team so that we can, in fact, achieve the goals, the challenges that we have outlined as the SDGs from the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Well, we have heard a number of topics that will help us to continue the conversation. But one that has come up at least 3 times is the classification of middle-income countries. This is the main focus of the discussion this morning. I'd like to ask the Secretary General, how do we assess MICs and the EU as well? Are we talking about the same thing? And what is the impact? This is, how to measure middle-income countries. Answer. Well, there's an advantage here. I agree with Jolita and Mario. We've worked a great deal on this. We have a significant level of agreement, but we still have a long way to go to be totally convinced, because we are bogged down in this classification of per capita GDP as the only element to discuss development. But as Mario has been saying and Jolita saying, but this world has changed. We're leaving it behind us. We've gone beyond this because of events. When I was participating in the UN program discussions on this, a minister from Cabo Verde was there. Now, Cabo Verde had moved from poor to middle income, and the minister said to me, one day I went to bed as a poor country and woke up as a middle-income country the next day. So things just changed overnight. But we have the same challenges, yet we're in another category. And there's still the same set of consequences, the consequences of this for this country. So I remember also in these discussions a report from Rabic and Wood which said, what happened to the poor? Where are they? 73% of people under the poverty threshold are in MICs. They're not in different countries from before. They're in the same countries, but the countries have changed category from poor to middle income. So it's not a change in geography, it's a change in economic classification. So if we really want to tackle the Sustainable Development Agenda, we will have to create our own conversation on development. If not, we won't be able to achieve these objectives. And I think this is an essential element in this. The question is, what is the conversation on development? We're all thinking, of course, that classification has to change, but we haven't been discussing how to expand resources. What we've been discussing is changing the interaction among ourselves and not the resources, extending resources. So I think the problem in this dialogue is that we always think what we want to do is to expand the resources base for mix, but no. But the problem is the exclusion in this discussion and how these middle-income countries can achieve the SDGs. This exclusion creates obstacles for the aims and objectives that we have. Now, to play around with words, I think I've said in English, we have to replace the word graduation with the word gradation. It's not that countries are graduating. It is that the requirements, the obstacles, the challenges faced by these countries are different. So this is why we're talking about changing approaches. To use the example of the EU, the EU has been opening up a way. They've been working along a good path. When speaking about high-income countries, though, the EU created significant instruments to take the lead on this. And one of this is the thematic windows, which could help significantly in achieving the SDGs. Because this is an approach that looks at the obstacles, the Gordian knots in trying to achieve the SDGs, the obstacles to cooperation, because cooperation is a useful instrument to help all countries to obtain better results in the face of these challenges. So this emerges from the conversation on development. It's a matter of changing the aid mentality, shifting towards cooperation, a cooperation mentality. It's much more than just aid. It's dialogue, it's partnership. Cooperation means joining hands to tackle the challenges. Somebody said it involves commitment, dialogue, alliances, and partnership, as somebody said very eloquently. It's not just a matter of aid. If we want to achieve real cooperation, we have to change our mindset. We have to change our view of aid in this context of cooperation. Now, Jolita and Mario both said something that I think is very important too. The OECD has indeed been working on the concept of transition, and perhaps Mario could tell us a bit more about this. CEPAL is working on closing the development gap. And I think there we have the seeds of being able to make progress, seeds of progress. But we have to free ourselves from the shackles of an agenda that had a sort of unilateral view and just looked at it from the point of view of development aid for progress. Because over the years, people have thought that there's just one recipe for development, one size fits all. This was a discussion in the 1980s, but today we know that with the emergence of countries in the South, we have much more complex realities and many different approaches and paths, as Mario was saying, different paths towards development with special characteristics in each case that have to be taken into account when we speak seriously about cooperation. One of the interesting issues, I think, is that with this emergence of the South, Mario, you were talking about China. Today, we are faced with a reality that is completely new to us in the world. And it is that the leading countries, the biggest countries in economic terms, are not necessarily the most developed countries. In the past, those countries that had the largest economies in the world were also the most developed countries in the world. But that is not the case today. The strongest countries, from an economic point of view, such as China, have a different reality. They are at the same time developing countries and have they tackle all the challenges of poverty, the development of infrastructure, of inequality of levels of development among the various regions in their countries. So it's a very different reality. On the other hand, they are taking up very significant leadership roles in the world. They have global responsibilities that they didn't have before. So this changes the angle of the discussion. Because now the sort of single approach that we used to have in the past is now obviously, patently, something that has to be changed. And I think Jolita also stated this very eloquently, the similarity in values between the various countries and the conversations we're having. Today, as things stand, I think the proposals, for instance, from the Caribbean states, the Latin American countries, and Europe all put together, for instance, in terms of the ambitions for climate change and sustainable development, were not de minimis but maximum positions. And I think the Caribbean played a significant role in the climate change. Latin America and Europe, we all had a united, joint position of joint voice which allowed us to achieve these international global agreements. And this gives us hope, because these were not agreements that were, just focusing on the minimum that could be done, but there were ambitious goals that we were able to achieve. So when speaking about values, we must remember that together we can achieve a lot more than when we approach these issues separately. Thank you. Maria Angelita, you wanted to add to this as well, Mario? Yes, I'd just like to emphasize this point. I think we all are convinced that the GDP measurement is limited. It's not a matter of individual likes, preferences. It's a matter that the GDP measurements are insufficient. This approach is insufficient. Now, the Attali Commission had sent Stiglitz and Fitoussi involved, and they started working together on this. And then the follow-up in this work. Now, they is playing the role of secretariat, and my colleague has achieved the establishment of measurements related to well-being, the well-being index. You can see all of this on the website. It's not an imposition, it's advice, but there is an indicator that exists, a well-being indicator. And Jalita was saying that on the 18th of May, Martin Duran, and it's not true to say that if we don't use GDP, there isn't any other way of measuring progress. This is not true. In 2015, the Global Forum on Statistics was held in Guadalajara, and 10 Latin American countries signed in favor of adopting this set of indicators to be able to measure and compare the situation within Latin America and, of course, with other countries. The advantage of the indicators is that it's not just limited to the GDP and the SDGs. We all had to handle the 130 indicators, and many of them didn't have statistics backing them up, and that's not very easy. So now it's easier to have a roadmap to guide public action and comparisons between countries. So in very practical terms, this can be done. With these new indicators, this can be done. Now, our view of this whole situation is something also that has to be placed in its historical context. It's true that there are some countries that needed the past 25 years to graduate and become high-income countries. And in Europe even, I consider that my country is still a developing country, but Spain, Portugal, and others received structural funds. This was 4% of the GDP over a 20-year period that allowed the countries in the less developed regions to develop. So it's a bit strange to tell middle-income countries. No, you can stand on your own now because you can. No. We're countries in a community. We had countries in this community that were supported substantially. Now, there's some countries that say they want to join the EU, but it's not so easy. But that's not the point. The point is the criterion to say, no, I'm going to reject or deny everything that happened in Europe and approach this differently. No, we have to look at the historical context. In all of this, there's one significant element in this changing international cooperation in which we must draw a distinction between aid and other forms of cooperation, which of course can include a financial component, but cooperation is really sharing experiences of public policy and strategy and development so that all can learn from each other. It is also a matter of building new areas for the measurement of CADs or CADs, but new areas in which we can discuss what is happening. I would love to see China involved, but they won't come, and India won't come, Brazil, I don't know, South Korea won't come. So it's not a matter of a substitute structure. I'm talking about a complementary structure, a complementary forum in which we could discuss all of these issues. But I'd love to see what India is doing, for instance, in greater detail.
I'd now like to hand over to the Chancellor, to the Minister. I'd ask you to be short so we can then have questions as well. I know this is a very passionate discussion. Well, it's very difficult to add anything after Mario and Rebecca. Thank you for giving me the floor, Christina. But nonetheless, I'd just like to conclude with my vision. For all of you, this seems normal. I mean, it all seems common sense, isn't it? No. We've fought 3 to 4 years to come to this reality. And this is quite a historic achievement. Because it's very difficult to change our philosophy, our vision of the world. I don't want to say religion. For some people, it's a religion. And for some people, they have just one way of saying things. ODA, Official Development Aid, and that's it. That's holy. But no, we are now in the 21st century, and we have to change. But 3 points here now. Development needs new solutions. We need this partnership, we need to work together, and we need to find these solutions or these answers. They're not there for the taking. We need to work with our partners to reach these solutions in areas where they are pertinent towards creating a world that's better for all of us. We have shared values already, and we have to now fight for this world that we share as well. The challenges are global, and therefore our response has to be global as well. We need people who share this vision, who are here today, and my request then would be to rethink this analytical work so that we can reach this vision and we can send this vision to all our member states in the European Union, as also the member states of the Development Center in OECD, with our partners in Asia, in Africa, so that we can see what we want and how we want to take these SDGs and use them to carry out shared commitment and shared engagement for the 21st century. I think this analytical approach is very important. I think this is the founding pillar, really, and without it, we can't really move ahead. For us in the European Union, this is very urgent, this is very important, because very quickly our internal discussions in the European Union in terms of funding of new instruments has to take place, and sadly our philosophy in terms of these funding instruments is going to be based on what we understand as development aid and development cooperation. So thank you very much to Rebecca, really, because we are rethinking this internal vision. We now have more visions to look at. We have more perspective on the table. Thank you very much. Chancellor, over to you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you to allow me to just make some concluding comments, especially from the perspective of my country. I completely agree with the criteria that have been outlined in this panel. We cannot continue to measure development on the basis of purely economic indicators. So we have to broaden our perspective. Firstly, we have to look at the reality. We have to look at complementarity, and that this categorization does not lead to a retrograde in what we have been doing in terms of national effort. So we cannot lead to a regression due to a certain category being applied to a country. I completely agree that we need shared positions. We need the private sector on board. We need the commitment of the public sector. We need active participation of the youth. This is something that our president has highlighted. The role of civil society is key. It is key to us achieving our goals. Yesterday, Jolita talked about something very interesting, and this is something that has really stayed with me with this meeting. And then, for example, she said cooperating with Honduras is an investment that gives you a good return. So it's quite incredible how this cooperation with the European Union is changing and transforming the lives of people in Honduras. When we're talking about food security, we're talking about health care, we're talking about healthy nutrition, family farms, transparency, when we're talking about project management, women's empowerment. I mean, I could be here all morning sharing all of these different positive experiences with you. But I would like to leave you with one final thought. The levels of poverty and vulnerability in our region, and in the specific case of Honduras, are not subject to political discussions. They do not live up to categorization, but these are moral priorities that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at solutions. Thank you. Now, we have a number of questions of very little time. So I'm going to ask you the questions, and I'll ask you to be as brief as possible, maybe bullet form in responding to these questions. And now I'll start with something that the minister just mentioned. And here the question is, what is the role of CSOs, civil society organizations, towards development? And maybe there's someone else who would like to step in as well in terms of organizations on the ground. Sylvia. Well, our projects serve as a voice. I think civil society is quite dynamic when we're talking about drawing up projects, when we're talking about involving civil society and its members. At the same time, civil society have to be active members in achieving the goals of a project. Precisely for this reason, I'd like to give you an example. You have All Invest 5.0, a project in Latin America that has a stand here that works directly with civil society. I think they work with the Chamber of Commerce in Bolivia. And these chambers of commerce exist all over Latin America, and they develop this cooperation. In Peru, for example, we're also working on this in some capacity. And in this way, to really carry out capacity building with small and medium-sized producers so that they can have a greater role to play in the entire value chain in agricultural production. So we are the executive, so to speak, and sometimes this is easier when we're talking about, if we would rather just talk about the public sector in international cooperation, I think things would be easier if we could get civil society and more aspects on board. So this is our experience that we've had. Another question. Now I'll direct this to Luis Tejada, because it refers to countries that are not necessarily in the focus of our panel, where we're talking about countries that are already considered higher income, like Chile or Uruguay. So what sort of role can they have in South-South cooperation, and what sort of a relation do you have with these countries? We come back to the classification, really, when we're talking about changes in the relation with them, etc., or do you think that you just look at projects and results? Well, these countries have very modern sectors, it has to be said. Even politically speaking, they are quite advanced and can be comparable to European countries. So with these countries, it's more about creating alliances and finding partners. And we have to try to see how we can act together in certain areas. Furthermore, it's about creating global public goods. Of course, there's a challenge here when this sort of traditional cooperation ends and you want to find new models. It's not always easy to find these new models. For example, currently, there's an issue in the OECD because Brazil, Costa Rica, Argentina, Chile, etc. are candidate members. So they are talking about how they can join the OECD. Brazil, for example, is a candidate, and this would be a fundamental shift, because Brazil was always considered a developing country, and now the perspective would change very greatly within the OECD itself if Brazil were to become a member. So we have to look beyond projects, for sure, beyond just agencies. The Pacific Alliance, for example, is an innovative change in Latin America, where you're going beyond just bureaucratic structures, and you're looking at things very pragmatically, trying to see how important alliances can be formed between the like-minded, so to speak. So I think we have to support these leadership roles, these capacities that these countries have to take other countries along with them within their same region. And I think that we can give them good support, but I think that we have to also talk about this political role that these countries can play much better than us. Because Chile or Mexico could be much more effective in the region than, say, some European country. So we must support this. And it's not just support in terms of financial aid, but it's also human resources and other soft skills. Thank you. Now, a specific question to Cholita. Now, when we're talking about the new development consensus, how can we talk about more and better South-South cooperation? There's also triangular cooperation in Latin America. Well, in this agreement, we're talking about more opening for this sort of work. We have an envelope, or rather we have a box where we outline all of this work, where we're talking about the importance of work with middle-income countries. It's a very new approach to development. Of course, there are challenges that we have to overcome to reach this new model of development. We have funding instruments that already exist, but even if we don't need too much in terms of financial aid, we do need financial aid. So we have to first outline these instruments for triangular cooperation. We have to come up with a new proposal. We will have a EU-CELAC summit in October, and we will try and find a name. What do we want to call this new model? Some of us liked one certain name, but maybe that's not very representative. And, well, one thing we want to call our group is Forward, Adelante. But let's see. We have to still discuss that. Now another question to Rebecca. Now all the panelists agreed in terms of the classification and that there are issues with this, that this methodology needs to change. So certain things have already been highlighted, but how do we change? What do we need to do to change this classification? Well, I think that the discussions within the development consensus is going to give the European Union the possibility to strengthen three instruments that they already have that I think were very important. Firstly, the South-South facility has also triangular aid. I think there was some experimentation on this front, and it is very important. It's very important now for this to continue to adapt itself and to strengthen triangular cooperation. Countries in the European Union are already doing this, so there's no reason why the European Union should not do this in a more reinforced way. Secondly, we have to also support thematic cooperation using the SDGs as a framework. Thirdly, we have to also support regional cooperation. Now, all of this remains applicable for Latin American countries and also in discussions for association agreements, because association agreements talk about cooperation on one hand, and these elements could be used and further strengthened with respect to what we've discussed here today. Now, these instruments are in the hand of the European Union, and I think that they have to overcome one difficulty, that there is no exclusivity, there's no exclusions, because this is what is difficult. There are countries in Latin America that are about to graduate, about to grade up, and the European Union in a way is obligated to respect these criteria as well. But I think this is where we need to really find solutions. We have to evaluate the state of play to ensure that there are no exclusions. Now, I don't know if politically this will be possible, but I think Jolita touched on this as well, that we still need to convince people here. There's a political work to be done in terms of discussions, dialogue. And this is something that I look at with much respect, because we might share positions, we might also disagree on things, but I respect your opinion, because in terms of cooperation, things are not always black or white. Also, when we discuss the issue of Eastern European countries, that there was a transition period where we created like a second list for the transition. Mario touched on this as well. Now, I think here we have to try and find a solution so that we do not start dividing Latin America into categories. Instead of dividing, let's converge. Let's try bring about some convergence between the Atlantic and the Pacific, the North and the South, the graduated, the still to graduate. I think that in this way we can use these shared opportunities. And that's what I would like to ask the European Union. Don't divide us, unite us. We need different cooperation at this point. And I'm trying to convince Jolita here, but in a way I'm preaching to the choir, because she's always convinced. But I think that we have to reach a win-win situation where we go beyond this dichotomy between recipients and donors, and we all work towards a common goal, greater cooperation, alliances, dialogue, partnerships to achieve the SDGs that are universal goals. So we have to overcome these exclusions because they don't help us to reach these universal goals. If I could just make a quick point in terms of civil society, because I think that's a very important issue. One of the things that we learned when we were talking about the Millennium Development Goals, something that Sylvia touched on as well, one of the things we learned from the MDGs was that long-term efforts depend on civil society, and that's what keeps effort going and makes it sustainable. So civil society can help to execute projects, they can help in innovation, but civil society also has to help in keeping the agenda going, in asking the government to provide account. In my country, for example, we say the issue with the governments in long term is that one person might gain, but then it's the other person that's left with the issues. So, because the government change every 4 or 5 years, and so some people benefit while they are in power, and then they leave the mess for the people to come. So, I think we cannot think in the short term, really. We have to come up with an agenda that goes beyond governmental mandate, and that's when we will have results. And this is a conversation that needs to happen. And civil society can help us to sustain this social conversation where we're looking at the long term, where we're looking at really moving ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's clear that there are many challenges, but we have also achieved a lot. It's very important here to look at the role that the Ibero-American region has played. It's also with the aid of the European Union. And I'll stay with something that Luis said in his first intervention, where he said that we have to talk about sharing, where we have to make this a global discussion in the region, and the region can then act as an example of good practices, debate, challenges. Thank you very much to everyone. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time for questions, but we can continue to discuss these topics informally. Thank you to the panelists as well. Thank you very much.